Good morning. Welcome to Grace. I'm Eric. We're in the middle of our, we're second week of our summer series on Jonah. And in case you missed last week, or you were sleeping, or you forgot, or something happened in between the week that you've forgotten, let me just kind of recap you with what's happening in Jonah, all right? So there's this prophet, and his name is Jonah, and he loves God, and he loves his country, and he would have fit perfectly in the middle of Kentucky. So God tells this prophet Jonah, I need you to go to Nineveh. And as we know, Jonah doesn't obey God. And the reason that Jonah doesn't obey God is because he doesn't like the Ninevites. And the reason that he doesn't like the Ninevites is because they are objectively bad people. Jonah is not just a racist. He doesn't just hate the Ninevites. The Ninevites are actually bad people. And Jonah does not want to go there. And he does not want to preach a message of redemption to them. And so he disobeys God. He goes down to Joppa, and he gets on board a ship, and he goes the opposite direction to a place called Tarshish, which is actually like 2,500 miles away from Nineveh. It is the complete opposite end of the earth. And as soon as he gets on the ship, they sort of set sail. It had to be like, I picture it being like immediately, but maybe it was a day out, maybe it was a few hours. God sends a storm. And we were reminded, and that's where we're at this morning, by the way. We're in the middle of the storm of Jonah's life. And last week, kind of recapping what we talked about, Jonah makes this huge mistake. First of all, he makes two mistakes. First, he thinks he knows best, and that's why he goes the opposite direction. And second, he thinks that he can escape the presence of God. He thinks that he can escape the presence of God. And I mentioned that theological word last week, omnipresence, which I don't expect anybody to remember. However, what that word means is very important. The fact that God's presence is everywhere and that you can't escape him. And I think last week, before we left, I kind of set the stage and I said, if we can't escape God, and there's no way to get away with our sin, and there's no way to run, there's no way to hide, then why don't we just embrace God? Why don't we stay in his presence? And if he's the God of love and of mercy that Jonah's actually afraid that he is, then why in the world would we want to run away from him? And so now, that's why Jonah is in this storm. He tried to run away from God, and he has just figured out that that's not possible. And if he's not going to go to the great city of Nineveh, God is going to send a great storm. Now, just before we kind of dive into this, and before we go any further, I just want to kind of give lay some groundwork for how exactly storms work, okay? So first of all, we got to remember that God is in control of every storm. He's in control of every storm. Literally, in the case of Jonah, he sends the storm. It's not a random storm. He literally sends it. We look at the book of Job, and there's these natural disasters, and we come to find out that it's actually God in control of all of it. You get to the New Testament, and you run into Jesus, right? And they're out on the boat, and in comes the storms, and it's getting bad, and Jesus is sleeping, kind of like Jonah does, all right? And they wake up Jesus, and Jesus is like, that's enough. God is in control of the storm. Now, this is kind of a bold thing, though, to think about, because just when we want to know what the weather is, we turn on the TV, and the weatherman tells us. And he doesn't tell us the weather for just today. He tells us the weather for the next 7 days. And he's wrong half the time, but at least it's somewhat reliable. There may be a storm coming in the afternoon. It may be actually lasting 3 hours instead of 1, but it's kind of half accurate. And so we kind of live in a world where we think that weather just constantly runs on cycles and that it really is nothing that could possibly change that. And yet in Jonah, we're reminded of the fact that God has power and control over something as methodical as weather. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that weather obviously runs in patterns and that you can, check your weather and trust that it's reliable. But we can't forget about the fact that the God who created weather has the ability to change the pattern of it and move it or set it up in such a manner that it impacts people. So we find out that God is in control of the storm. I think it's interesting in the book of Job, and this is just kind of a fascinating little thought. In the book of Job, there's this storm that kind of comes on Job's life, all these natural disasters, and it's actually Satan that does it. God doesn't cause every bad storm. We should know that. God's not the cause of most storms. It's the cause of Jonah's storm, but not most storms. But the interesting thing is, even though it's Satan that's doing this destruction on Job's life, God is in control. We kind of have this image where like Satan can just destroy us and kind of reign over us, and yet we kind of figure out though that it's actually, he's more like a dog on a leash, so to speak. God didn't cause the storm, and yet Satan we know is not, he can't just do whatever he wants. We learn that God is in control. Second thing we kind of know about storms, and we have to be cautious, is that when we go to the book of Genesis and we read about how the world is supposed to be, we have to remember that God did not create the world for storms. The world's not supposed to experience death. There's not supposed to be natural disasters. There's not supposed to be devastating changes in world history. This is not supposed to be the case. All right, we have to remember that in the beginning, it was good. The storms were caused by man's sin. And when I say storm, I'm not just talking about rain, right? I'm talking about all of the stuff that we've got to deal with in life, the figurative storms and the literal storms. I mean, right now in the South, they're literally dealing with hurricanes. They're real storms. And the third thing we have to keep in mind, just to kind of set the groundwork for storms, right, is that ultimately, at the end of every storm, there is an ability to lead people back to God, which is what we're kind of talking about this morning. It's really that we boil it down, right? We're not just talking about storms. We're talking about how can something that's bad, how can the loss of a family member, how can a father dying or a son dying, how can a miscarriage, how can a job loss, how can a hurricane that wipes out a home, how can the worst possible things that we can imagine, how can those things which are so bad actually be good? But as we start to work our way through the story of Jonah, and we figure out about Jonah's storm, and we learn a little bit about storms in the process, we come to find that ultimately every storm will lead us back to God. Now, before we go any further, I just want to kind of set some groundwork here and figure out exactly where we're at and how much we have in common with Jonah. So I'm going to ask some questions, and I want you to raise your hand, but you don't have to raise it high. You can put it halfway up. Don't put it all the way up. You don't have to. You can put both hands up, I suppose, if you want. I'm not going to call on you, so you just need to, just let me know if it's you. And so if any of these experiences are related to you, just kind of let me know, okay? So, anybody here? Thank you. Yes, I see that. Is there a question back there, Neil? Put your hand down. I haven't even asked the question yet. All right. Last year, if you've experienced the loss of a family member or a friend or a loved one that you have, last year, just the last year, if someone in your family has passed away, so there's a couple hands, all right, or a friend. All right, keep your hands up as I go along here. Last year, if you could think of maybe a financial setback. I'm not saying that you went broke, okay? But last year, if you experienced a financial setback, there was something that came up, something broke down, something you didn't expect. You had an issue with finances in the last year. Anybody? Okay, some of us. How about last year, if you had a medical setback, and maybe you've bounced back from it already, but sometime in the last year there was something medical that came up. You either maybe hurt yourself or something unexpected came up, and it was kind of a setback, either because of finances or work or anything else. All right, anybody? A couple? All right. How about in the last year, if you've experienced some kind of other big event? This is the catch-all, I guess, right? If you've experienced family challenges, arguments, if you've had to move, you've had to change jobs, you've been kind of flipped up over, would you say that there's been maybe one time in the last year that you've had a major storm? Most of us. Okay, so I said the last year. If any of those things have applied to you in the last 5 years, that's recent history, all right? You all can remember that, I hope. All right, anybody, if any of those things have been mentioned the whole time have occurred in the last 5 years, can I see your hand? All right. Everybody's hand is in the air. If it's not in the air, I want to be you because your life is good. Your life is real good. All of us have dealt with storms. We've all dealt with storms, maybe not literal storms in the sense, but figurative storms. We've dealt with things that are disastrous in our life. We've dealt with problems. We've had to deal, some of us maybe have had to deal with real natural storms. But all of us in here can relate, at least somewhat, to the experience of Jonah, who's having his life turned upside down in the middle of this boat. Now, I want to kind of walk through as we go through this. I want to talk a little bit about what kind of storms we might face, and kind of talk a little bit about what the storms in Jonah's case really are. So the first kind of storm that you might face, all right, is the kind that are caused by you. The sort of storms that are all about you, all right? It's your problem. That's what's happening in Jonah's case, right? Jonah sins, he hops on the boat, there's a storm. The reason there's a storm is because of Jonah. Jonah sinned, God literally sends a storm. And it's devastating. Now, the interesting thing about this is, all right, that it's literally a storm that's just totally powerful and it's like immediate. And sometimes God does that with our sin. Sometimes you do something and God responds instantly. I think even like with natural consequences of sin, there are some sin that you do to yourself that will have immediate and tragic events. Think drug abuse. Someone who overdoses on drugs. It's not God that sends that, but that's an effect of their sin. You overdose on drugs, and it's immediate, it's sudden, it's dramatic, and it's a reaction to your own sin. But I think even in our own lives, sometimes God interferes, and we may not necessarily know it. I've heard of stories from people who are thinking about killing themselves, thinking about suicide. And suicide, it's a sin. That's not how you were meant. You're not supposed to harm yourself. But I've heard stories where people are about to kill themselves, and then suddenly they get a phone call from somebody they knew 5 years ago, or somebody just randomly calls them right at the moment, right? And it changes their whole life. It saves them. And God interferes suddenly in the midst of the storm. I've heard stories where like people are thinking about running away, and they get into their car and they're trying to leave their wife, they're trying to deal with all these issues, and the car doesn't work. Right? Suddenly it breaks down. We've all heard of stories where people are doing something they're not supposed to be doing, right? They're with somebody they're not supposed to be with. They're looking at stuff they're not supposed to be not looking at. And then all of a sudden, wherever they're at, somebody shows up that they didn't expect. Somebody from church is suddenly right there while you're at the restaurant with this other person you're not supposed to be with. You're looking at something, if you're a kid, this is like life experience, right? You're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, and next thing you know, there's Uncle Bob walking down. Oh no, this is the disaster. Sometimes God interferes in dramatic and sudden ways like he does to Jonah. However, I want to say that that's not the norm. Normally, our own sin does not have that sudden consequences. Normally, it's probably more like radiation. If you get a chance, there's a miniseries on HBO. It's pretty cool. It's called Chernobyl. It's about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Really interesting. In the nuclear disaster in Russia, this power plant has a meltdown, and basically it explodes, okay? And everybody around the power plant is suddenly exposed to radiation. And if you watch the show, it's kind of stunning because the individuals who are a part of this don't really know what it can do to you or the effects that it have. And so they leave these people in the surrounding neighborhoods there longer than they should be. And there's this one really like scary scene when you watch the show of these people on a bridge, and they're just having a good time and they're hanging out. It must be Friday night in Russia. I don't know what they do there. But they're just hanging out, having a good time. There's an explosion. It's far away. I don't even think they knew about it, but they see this ash coming down on them. And they're just laughing. They're sticking their tongue out like it's snow, just giggling and having a good time. What they don't know, though, is that they're dying. It's radioactive ash. It's going to kill them. And it's not going to kill them right away, but over years and years and years, it will destroy them from the inside. That's what sin does to us. Most of the time, the impact of sin is over time, and it tears us apart on the inside. It rips out our conscience. It wears us down. It beats us down. And we have to deal, and we're stuck in the middle of a storm after years and years and years and years of trying to get something. The other type of storm, so there's some storms that are caused by us. The other type of storm that some people deal with are storms that are caused by other people. Okay? These are what the sailors are dealing with. So Jonah, he gets on the boat, right? And he gets these sailors to take him along for the ride. And this is what I think is really interesting. Jonah's a prophet, right? He's supposed to be the good guy. He's like, you invite the pastor with you. He's supposed to be nice. He's supposed to pray for your food. He's not supposed to swear or drink or anything like that. He's just supposed to be a great guy, okay? And the sailors are like the pagans. They're supposed to be the bad guys, okay? They're supposed to be the guys that you don't want to hang out with. They worship false gods. They don't go to church on Sunday, all right? They only eat Chick-fil-A like once a week. These are the bad dudes. Well, here's the crazy thing about the story. This is what's kind of funny to me, okay? It turns out that the pagan sailors are actually decent dudes. They're kind of fun, nice guys. They're really, kind to Jonah, and when things are getting bad, they actually try to help Jonah out, all right? They could just chuck him overboard right away, but no, they try and save his life. Meanwhile, Jonah, the prophet, is a bum. Literally a bum. He brings on this disaster to them. What does he do? He goes downstairs and sleeps. I mean, it is just the worst. And so these sailors are in the middle of a storm. It's devastating. It could destroy their lives. And it's Jonah's fault. That's why they're experiencing it. And so sometimes in life, we experience storms because of other people. I work with a kid right now who's dealing with a storm that's called divorce. And he didn't cause the storm. It's not his fault. He couldn't change the outcome, and yet he has to deal with the consequences of it. And I don't know what, divorce is always kind of a sticky thing. I don't know what all is going on in their family or who's at fault or this and that, but I know that this kid is in the middle of a storm. And he's had to change his school, all right? He's had to change where he's living, and now he's got to deal with, and you can just imagine, right? Sometimes this stuff happens to kids, and we just say, oh, that's all right, that's all right. Could you imagine if you did that to an adult? We're going to move your home, we're going to change your friends, and we're going to, just totally upend you. That's what this kid's dealing with. And now he's got to deal with these people, the only people that have been in his life the whole time, fighting and arguing with each other and saying nasty things. He's got to deal with all these new relationships, boyfriends and girlfriends. It's a disaster. It's a disaster, and it's not his fault. And he has to deal with it. I know I've shared a little bit about my story with some of you at various things. And so when I grew up, my mother had an alcohol problem. And that's just something I had to deal with as a kid. And my stepfather, who kind of came along a little bit later, was very abusive. He also had an alcohol problem, only he didn't go to the bar. He stayed at home, which was even worse. And so that was something that I had to deal with over and over and over again. And if you've ever had to deal with abuse, and alcohol abuse, drug abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual, if you've ever had to deal with abuse, it's like storm season. It's hurricane after hurricane after hurricane after hurricane, and it just beats down on you, and it beats down on you, and it wears you down. And unfortunately, some of the people who experience the very worst storms in their lives, it's not their fault. They didn't do anything, and yet they're in the middle of it. So there's some storms that are caused by ourselves, and then there are storms that are caused sometimes by our sin onto others, or other people's sin onto us. And then there's the third kind of storm, and I actually think this is the most common. When I listed all those things at the beginning, this is actually probably what most of the things that are going on in our lives are about. They're the storms that are caused just by living in a broken world. All right, this isn't what Jonah's storm is, by the way, but most of our storms are simply caused by living in a fallen and a broken world. Most storms are not caused by individuals. All right, most of them are not. We don't know exactly who's at fault. It's just by the fact that we live here. Let me kind of give you an illustration of this. When the airplane was invented by the Wright brothers, okay, they had to come and they had to fly it in this area to try and get it approved by the government. They actually flew it in College Park, which I think is pretty cool, and I didn't really know that until I looked this up, but they actually flew in the College Park airport. which I actually think they probably built the airport for them because I don't think there were planes before then. But they had to fly in Fort Myers, which is bound by Arlington, and they had to do these test flights with the Army to get the Army to pay for the airplane so they could make money, okay? And as they're flying, they go up. Orville Wright takes with him a young Army officer on one of these test flights. And so they take off, and they're flying. Everything's good. They're flying. Suddenly they hear this boom, and the plane goes straight down, 75 feet down, crashes. Orville Wright is seriously hurt. He's down for the count. He's out for 6 months. The young Army officer that's with him dies. He is the first person of many more to come to die from an airplane crash. Why did that happen? Who's at fault? When they took off, they inspected the airplane. Everything was fine. Everything worked. Everything was good. It turns out when they got up in the air and they're flying, the propeller suddenly broke, snapped off. And when it broke, it took out the steering apparatus, and so the plane just went right down. And that young man died. We're reminded of the fact that we live in a world that's broken. And sometimes the things that we drive or ride break down, and sometimes we break down physically. Our bodies break down. And we just live in this world that's broken and fallen, and we're reminded that sin hasn't just disrupted humans, hasn't just disrupted society, it's disrupted the entire ecosystem. It's set everything out of order. And so because of that, there are all these storms, there's death, there's disease, there's pain, there's suffering. All of that is caused by the fact that the world we live in is broken. Jesus addressed this, these kind of storms. In Luke 13, 4-5, there's apparently this tower in Jerusalem. The tower falls down and it kills 18 people. So the people come together and they ask Jesus later on, they're like, Jesus, were these guys' sin worse than everybody else in Jerusalem? And what they're really asking Jesus, right? They're kind of like, Jesus, are these guys worse than everybody else? Did they have it coming? Did they have it coming when that tower fell off and just crushed them? And Jesus says to these guys, he says, no, they didn't have it coming. I added that part on. But he just says no. And then he says something that's very important to help understand how storms work and why we have storms in our lives and what purpose they may play. He says no, but, he says, if you do not repent, you will also perish. Jesus kind of puts storms into perspective. I mean, think about all of the stuff in our lives, the stuff that we might call storms. Think about death. Think about miscarriage. Think about tragedies. Think about 9/11, the Holocaust. Think about cancer. Think about a tsunami. Think about those storms that are hitting the South. All right? All of those things are very terrible. All of those things are horrible. And yet at the same time, we have to kind of remember, that at the end of the day, everybody's going to die. Nobody's getting out of this thing alive. And we're kind of reminded of the fact, Jesus kind of points this fact to us, the whole world is going down a path of destruction. Everything's going to end this way. Whether it's a tower that crushes you or you die in old age, the whole world is heading towards destruction. And ultimately, the purpose of these storms can end up pointing us back to Jesus. They end up leading us back to Jesus. Jesus says, if you don't repent, you're going to perish. And so we're reminded at the end of this thing that every storm, whether it's natural, whether it's something we've done in our own lives, whether it's somebody else doing something to us, it has the ability to point us to God. It has the ability for the Christian, for the one who knows God, it has the ability to lead us back to God. And for the non-Christian, it has the ability for them to come wake up and realize that they need God. And so every storm has the ability to lead us back to Him. Has the ability to lead us to Christ. That's the purpose of Jonah's storm. The whole reason the storm is there, it's not to wreck Jonah's life. It's not to tear up the ship. It's not to do any of that. It's to get Jonah back on path. It's to turn him back to God. Now, I guess it should be of some value, right? Just because there is a storm in your life does not mean it's going to lead you to God. It doesn't mean that. We know lots of people who experience really bad situations, really terrible things, and it actually turns them away from God. So though it has the ability to lead you to God, it doesn't always. And you know what? We can always be a little resistant. Like I said, so Jonah, he's on this boat, and I think he'd like to resist this storm. It says he's on the boat, and I literally think, it's not certain when you read the story, but I literally think that Jonah's kind of up on the boat hanging out, and then he sees the storm coming. And he sees it rolling in, right? And so I'm thinking that Jonah sees the storm and then heads down. That's kind of how I kind of read it. I think Jonah sees the storm. I think he heads down. It's not certain, but I think he knows what's happening. Instead of warning the sailors, instead of repenting to God, Jonah heads down, and it says that he goes to sleep. It says that he's down there below deck, deep in the ship, taking a nap. He's trying to pretend that the storm that he caused that's in his life is not there. Now, if Jonah was an American, he'd probably stop on the way down. He'd grab a tub of Ben & Jerry's, and then he'd hit down below deck. He'd open up his computer, and he would binge watch Netflix for probably 10 hours. Okay, he'd watch all of season 3 Stranger Things, and he'd move his way to another. He'd just be watching Netflix all day long. Okay, every single one of us kind of knows what it's like to be in the middle of a storm and then not do anything. We all know what it's like to pretend that stuff that's going on in our lives isn't there. We all know what it's like to go. Sometimes it's literally we sleep in when we know we shouldn't. Sometimes we binge watch Netflix. Sometimes we eat. Sometimes we do all kinds of stuff to pretend that the storm that is in our life isn't there. And what we know about Jonah and what we know about life is that you can't alleviate or eliminate storms by pretending that they're not there, by refusing to face them. It's not like that's going to work. You can't just hide below deck for 10 hours and come up and, the storm is gone. It doesn't work for Jonah. Jonah gets woken up. He literally gets woken up. And they get him up. And so he's trying to hide. It's not going to work because God has sent the storm to wake him up. The sailors aren't going to leave him there. They go to wake him up. And ultimately, when we have storms that are going in our lives, right, when we've got stuff that's happening to us, we're reminded of the fact that we have to wake up. We can't hide. We can't pretend it's not there. We have to wake up and face it. There's a fairy tale. Let me just read you a little fairy tale to kind of bring this into perspective of this wicked witch who lives in a cottage deep in the woods. Wicked witch lives in the cottage deep in the woods, and as people come by, she offers them room and board. She gives them the most delightful bed you could possibly imagine, and she cooks them delicious meals, and she makes them feel so great. However, this witch, she has a bed that is full of dark magic. And if you travel through and you decide to sleep in the bed and you fall asleep, you will wake up and turn to stone in the morning. And she will add you to her collection of statues, so the story says. Well, this witch had a young lady that was serving her, and the young lady could not resist the witch. But she had pity on the people that would come. And she was sad. Well, one day a man comes to stay at the witch's house. And the young lady, she pities this man so much that she sneaks in and she sticks thorns and thistles and rocks and all sorts of things in the bed. And when the man goes to sleep on it, he's tossing and he's turning and he's filled with pain. Every time he moves, he's jabbed in the side. And then he turns again and he's jabbed in the side and he's removing stuff and he can't get rid of the stuff in his bed and it hurts him and it's painful. And finally the guy's like, I'm out of here. I've had enough. So he gets up out of the bed, he heads to leave, and on the way out he sees the servant girl and he berates her. Why would you do this to me? This is terrible. Your bed is horrible. And he walks out. And the servant girl says, the misery you know now is nothing like the infinitely greater misery a comfortable sleep would have brought upon you. Those sticks and stones were of love. Sometimes God put sticks and stones into our bed to wake us up, to get us to realize where we're at is not where we are meant to be. Sometimes we're poked and we're prodded and we don't understand what's going on, and yet it's all the work of God to lead us back. That is what's going on with Jonah. What we end up finding out at the end of this, right, is that there's redemption in our storms. I can see this in my own life. I shared with you, like, my mom was an alcoholic and my stepfather was abusive. And in my own life, right, I look back, and because I lived in a house that I didn't want to be at, and so I was always kind of out and about, I managed to find myself into a youth group when I was 15. And while I was at that youth group, I heard about Jesus, which I had never heard about before. And the other kind of side, I always think about this too, that's interesting, is because my stepfather was a very nasty person, you didn't want to be around him, I spent a lot of time as a kid in solitude. Right? I spent a lot of time up in my room. I spent a lot of time by myself, and I started to read. And so where some of my friends were maybe playing video games or watching TV, that wasn't an option for me. I just would read, and I learned to love reading. Well, when I got saved at 15, I picked up the Bible, and I just started reading it. And it was natural to me, because that's what I did. And so I kind of look at it, and I realize it's hard to look back and look at that, but I know that even during that time, God was working in my life. He was doing something to make me the man of who I am today. And so I see in my own life redemption in the storms that I've had in my past. When you think about Jonah, okay, so let me just kind of give you how this works with Jonah. Jonah's on the boat. He gets woken up by the sailors. They have this discussion. They're like, hey, Jonah, who are you? And Jonah tells them, I'm Jewish. I worship the God of the seas and the earth. All right. And then they kind of figure out, they draw lots to see who actually this storm is about. All right. And they draw Jonah's name. Surprise. Okay. And they have this conversation. Jonah finally feels pity for these sailors. He's like, all right, guys, you want to get rid of this storm? Throw me overboard. Throw me overboard. The moment you throw me overboard, this storm will stop. Well, you guys remember, the sailors are actually decent dudes. They're decent dudes. They're like, Jonah, we're not going to throw you overboard. And so they row and they row and they row and they row, trying to get back to land. Well, that doesn't work because it's God that sent the storm. Okay, so it doesn't work. Finally, the sailors are like, okay, we got no other options. Grab him. Off he goes. Okay, 1, 2, 3, off Jonah goes. He gets thrown into the sea. And what should end in death, and what should be the very worst possible thing that you could imagine, being thrown in the ocean in the middle of the storm, doesn't. God sends this big fish, and it swallows Jonah. And miraculously, he's in the middle of the fish for 3 days, all right? And during that time, he prays a prayer. It leads him back to God. And then, lo and behold, as soon as he repents, that fish spits him off on land, and guess where he's right on track for? Nineveh. In the end, Jonah's storm leads to his redemption. I think the craziest thing about the story is the sailors. All right, these sailors, they're in the storm. They have to deal with it. It's not their fault. They throw Jonah over. Okay, it's the worst storm of their lives because these are sailors. Remember, they deal with storms on a regular basis. The fact that the storm was so bad that they knew that it had to be sent from God, can you imagine what that must have been like? So as soon as they throw Jonah over, the storm stops. And this is absolutely stunning to these sailors. It says that they're terrified. They're terrified because they've now experienced the power of God that they've never seen before in their false gods. And it turns out that the sailors, because of this storm, end up turning to God. They make vows, they make sacrifices, they come to have faith in the God of Jonah because of the storm of Jonah. And so in the end, these sailors, who nobody would expect coming to know God, actually come to know him. And there is redemption in the storm for the sailors. And when we look at our own lives, we end up discovering the fact that deep in our storms, even when we can't see it, even when it's not clear to us, even sometimes when we have to look back, we end up finding out that deep in our storms, there is redemption. And even when you're hurting, and even when things are painful, and even when it's not clear what you're going to do with how things are going right now, we end up finding out that God is at work and he is doing good. There's a very popular Bible verse, Romans 8:28. It says, "We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." And so that verse reminds us that if you know God and you trust in him, that ultimately God is going to do good for you. It's going to do good for you. And so even when things are the worst you can possibly imagine, even when everything is going downhill, even when you can't imagine the way out, you're reminded of the fact that there is redemption deep in your storm. You're reminded of the fact that God is doing good even when everything looks bad. And you're reminded of the fact that God is at work. Now, before we end, I just want to point out something, okay? Before we finish this up, I want to point out something that's very real, okay? There's redemption in our storms. That's a fact. You can write that down. You can put it on the fridge. You can put it in your heart. You can store that somewhere. You can put it on a bumper sticker. Whatever you want to do. Redemption. There's redemption in our storms. That is a fact. You can take it to the bank and cash it. Promise you, it is a fact. But let me just be real, because when you hit the storm, sometimes the facts are lost. Sometimes when you hit it so hard, you can recite that over and over and over and over again, and it's not going to make sense. You know, you try and tell somebody who's lost their child, oh, there's going to be redemption in the storm. That doesn't make sense. How can that possibly be the case? You know, if you're dealing with like a job transition or a new home and you tell somebody, don't worry, there'll be redemption in the storm, how in the world is that how does that even make sense? And so I think before we leave, I have to be really honest with you. There are times in our lives where you can store up facts and knowledge and truth, and in the moment it will not be clear to you. It may be clear a year down the road, but in the moment it won't be clear to you. And in the pain and the suffering that's so devastating, there's nothing you can do. You can't even sometimes pray. You're just in so much pain, you don't know how to do this or that. That's a real part of storms. Most of the storms that we deal with, if I ask you to think about what's the most tragic event, you couldn't sit there and say, there's redemption in the storm. That's a luxury. You can't do that in real life. No matter how hard you put truth on you, when you hit it, it hits hard sometimes and it hurts. And before we leave, I just want to say that there is a plan by God for us, his people, the church, to deal with that kind of stuff. And do you know what the plan is? It's this. All right, if there's redemption in our storms, then I think the church has got to be the storm shelter. It's got to be the storm shelter. It's got to be the place where when you can't stand on your own, that people should be holding you up, that people should be strengthening you. Why is it when somebody passes away, or there's a new baby, or there's a job change, why is it we all sign up and we give meals to somebody? It's not just because we're nice people. I mean, we are. But we do it because they need it, because that's what the church does. It takes care of each other. Why is it when somebody moves, or there's a wedding, or there's something, we all kind of chip together and we help meet that need and that change in life? Because that's what the church does. Why is it when somebody has a car that breaks down, or they have an issue here and there, why is it? It always stuns me the way that generosity just comes and flows out of it, right? And we chip together in a way that we would never do just like for any random person at work or here and there. That's what the church does. We're a storm shelter, and we're supposed to be holding each other up. And when the pain of suffering is so real, I'm always amazed when there's a funeral, how many people from our church just show up. Sometimes for people they don't know. Just they had a relationship with someone in the church. That's what the church does. And so as we kind of wrap this up and we finish this up, I want to challenge you. First of all, if you're dealing with a storm, you can always remember the fact that God is there, that he's doing a good work, that there is redemption in the storm. That's true. Hang on to that. Put that on your... But the real message here, right, is that all of us, in the process, have to help hold each other up. We've got to be the storm shelter. We've got to be there looking out for one another. This is a group thing when we're facing the storm. That's what the church is supposed to be. There's redemption in our storms. This is the storm shelter. And this is the place that we need to come when we're suffering and we're hurting and we're broken. Join me as we pray. Father, some of us right now, we're coming into worship, and there are real storms in our lives. And we're dealing with job changes, home changes, we're dealing with death, we're dealing with loss. Some of this stuff has happened in the last year, and it's still fresh. The scars are still there, and it still hurts in a very real, tangible way. And yet, God, when we come and we hear your word, we're reminded of the fact that you are good. You are good, and you are doing a good thing in our lives. And sometimes it's not clear, and sometimes it won't be clear until we get to heaven, but we, Lord, can trust in you and have a hope that you will work all things out for good, that there actually is redemption in our storms. And so, God, I pray that as we deal with life, that we'd be drawn to you. Lord, I pray for us as a people. We've got people right here who are dealing with stuff, and then there's some others. It's our job to hold each other up. God, give us the strength. Make us the people that you've called us to be. Make us the kind of people that are holding each other up, that are looking out for one another, that are praying for one another, that are meeting the needs of one another. God, make this the place where you are most present, and it's obvious, and it's real. Lord, that's who we want to be. We want to be your people. And we want to be good as you are good to us. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen.